When I was around 8 or 9 years old, my parents left the house and left me with my sickly grandma. She was asleep at the moment because of a high fever, so I took the $5 that my dad had left for me to go and buy some sweets. I went to the shop close by that was literally right in front of my house and not even a few minutes walk away. As a dumbass kid though, I left the door not locked, and that was a big mistake. When I opened the door as I got back, I saw shoes in the middle of the hallway that hadn't been there when I left. Instantly, I knew that something was off here. I silently opened the kitchen door and was shitting my pants that someone might be there in the kitchen. I looked behind the fridge first because I remembered hiding behind it whenever I was playing with my siblings. There was no one back there, so I felt much calmer now. I grabbed my candies and yogurt and grabbed out a spoon from my drawer. Then I opened my parents' bedroom. Because I could only access my own room by going through theirs. I froze the moment I did so though, because I could clearly see a man's head hiding behind the sofa. Of course he'd seen me coming. I cried and ran to my grandma to tell her everything, and she immediately thought that I was lying. I started crying and saying I didn't want to die. My grandma finally said she would check it out, but I screamed for her not to. There was no way she would be able to do anything about this. My granny took her cell phone and called 997. I live in Poland, so the police number is different than in America. I told them everything, and they told us to go to a safe place. My granny locked up the door with her keys, which was a good move. We then slipped out and went to our neighbor. She was terrified and said we could stay the whole day until they caught him if we needed to. The police came after 15 minutes though. We heard yelling and a struggle, then they caught him. He looked very off, like he was on something as they were dragging him out. Luckily, he didn't steal anything or hurt anyone. He was just on drugs. We could safely come back home after. It was a good ending with nobody getting hurt, and a lesson for me to lock the door every time. To this day, I always check 8 times, especially if I'm not sure that I've actually locked it. My parents bought a house in a poor neighborhood that was south of Washington State. When we first moved in, me and my family introduced ourselves to the neighbors. They lived about 2 houses down. The mom established a friendship with my own mother, and they became very close friends. They were both moms, and they connected with very similar interests in art and various other things. That neighbor's name was Heather, and Heather had 2 kids. At the time, they were both in high school. Their names were Sierra and Jordan. My mom wanted me to meet up with them since my parents were looking around for a babysitter, and she wanted it to be someone she could trust since the area was not the greatest environment for kids. After spending some time with Jordan and Sierra, I got to know them a little, and frankly, I quite enjoyed their company. They watched over me as babysitters, and hanging around them made me feel much more superior than the average 5-year-old. Jordan was a rebel-like teen who would constantly get in trouble at school. My mother was not a huge fan of Jordan constantly getting in trouble, so eventually my mom stopped having him come over. Sierra was a very kind and courteous person and began babysitting me all by herself. She was a freshman in high school and needed the money. She became my childhood babysitter. She had no history of being in trouble at school or at home or of doing anything bad, so my mother gladly let her babysit me all the time. Sierra would play board games with me, cook my favorite macaroni and cheese, and I eventually became very close with her within a short span of time. My parents at the time had full-time jobs, so they started to ask Sierra to babysit me more and more, and in return she would get paid even more as well. Needless to say, she readily took up the offer, and I spent more time with her every day. I began to think of Sierra as one of my best friends at the time. She really did have a huge impact on my life. She also began working with my mom as a house cleaner. Everything was going great for me and my family overall. A couple of years go by and I was just beginning elementary school and going into the first grade. My parents began picking me up from school and I had less time for a babysitter. I became somewhat distant from Sierra as she had become a junior and was now pregnant. She would still sometimes come over to the house and babysit me and help my mother with a few chores around the house, but she became much more mature and would not talk to me as much as she used to. Her mother, Heather, had a severe medical condition which caused her to have constant and very painful headaches that she would experience for days at a time. Heather became a recluse, staying inside of her house with Jordan and Sierra. Sierra's demeanor began to change as her mother's condition began to worsen. That was understandable at the time, since her mother was going through a very rough thing. She began displaying an odd change in behavior, though, and started getting into a lot of trouble, especially at school. I'm not entirely sure what exactly for, but it started to really put a strain on Heather and Sierra's relationship. They began to verbally fight with each other almost every day. We could hear Sierra screaming at her from their house and flipping out on her for very insignificant reasons. My mother caught wind of these altercations and told Sierra that she couldn't babysit me anymore. She could still help her out with chores when I wasn't there, though. One day, Sierra was helping my mom clean out the basement when she asked if she could use our bathroom. She came back down to the basement 5 minutes later and finished cleaning. Later that day, my mom had to use the restroom. When she walked in, she saw what looked like a diary on the bathroom sink. My mom didn't recognize it, and with curiosity, she opened the book to see what this was. What she found inside was absolutely terrifying. My mother found sections of the diary which graphically talked about mere solemnization. My mom never got into the specifics of what was inside, and she still doesn't like talking about it to this day. She found Sierra's name on the back of the diary and immediately called Heather and confronted her about this. Heather stated that Sierra had taken notes from one of her books and was writing them down in her diary. She acted like Sierra did this all the time and it was no big deal. My mother then told Heather that Sierra was not allowed back in the house, and she wasn't going to be working with her anymore either. She purposely left that diary there, but for what reason I honestly don't know. Sierra began to claim that my neighbor Rodney had essayed her. Everybody in the neighborhood became skeptical of her claim, though, due to her troubled behavior and never having had much interaction with him ever. Sierra never called the police. Rodney was never questioned about the accusations, and Heather's medical condition worsened. As a result, she died while Sierra and Jordan were both in their senior year of high school. Sierra dropped out of high school and claimed she would be moving to Arizona with her then boyfriend. She ended up moving out and going to Arizona, while Jordan moved in with his dad. When they left, nobody thought they would ever hear from Sierra again, since she had moved on with her life. A few years went by and I didn't hear anything from either of them. Frankly, I kind of forgot about them over the years, honestly. One day, my parents talked to John, a neighbor who lived across the street, and he asked if they remembered Sierra, if they'd heard from her ever since she left. My parents said they hadn't heard anything since she'd moved. John said he'd recently seen her on the news. She had been arrested for abusing her child in Arizona. The police arrived at her home after she dialed 911 and found her daughter deceased. She had been collecting welfare and living in a trailer with her 2 children. Those kids were severely neglected and suffered from malnutrition. She wouldn't give the children anything to eat or drink. There wasn't any air conditioning in the trailer either, and Sierra would just leave them there for extended periods of time to go to a friend's house or her boyfriend's house. She ended up going to trial in court for child neglect and killing her own daughter, and now is serving a 16-year prison sentence. I still can't believe to this day that someone my family trusted me with and was a best friend of mine for the majority of my childhood years could possibly do something this cruel and inhumane. I hope that she never has another child in her life and never gets another dollar from welfare. My high school friends and I made a pact our senior year to go urban exploring every weekend before graduation. Our ultimate goal was to hit every cool abandoned spot in town before we all headed off on our different ways to different colleges. We'd take Tim's car and Jared would be our navigator. It was up to me to find us the gems of the operation, the destinations themselves. I stayed up late scouring the internet for any place that was little known or run down. Anything, such as abandoned restaurants, houses, parks, even a radio station that ran out of business, things like that. After school, I would also look through the history books to find even more places that were not online or were completely forgotten by the public. There were quite a few hidden gems in there too. We couldn't get much exploring done during the week though, so we confined most of them to the weekends and school breaks. We actually got a lot of ground and always brought some weed to enjoy the trip a bit more if the spot we found was not as cool as we thought it would be. We also always brought a camera courtesy of Jared, so we wouldn't miss any of the moments even while stoned. We stored the developed photos between the three of us and looked back on our journey every once in a while. Some of them I even still have. It was one of these places that I want to talk to you about, but not for any cool reason or fond memory to look back on. It was the day Jared almost lost his foot and maybe even his life. We decided to go to this abandoned supermall next to the highway leading out of town. Apparently, the mall hadn't been making enough money for the owners to consider it a profit, but instead of tearing it down or converting it into something else, they just left it there to decay and become infested by pests, food and all. It was a bit of a drive out there too, and we didn't really know where we were going. Google Maps had removed the street address long ago. After some detours, we managed to pull into the lot though. The parking lot was massive, yet completely empty, the biggest stretch of black asphalt I'd ever seen. It was just getting dark, so the parking lights were just blinking on. They seemed to coat everything we could see in a blue fluorescent glow. I'm not going to lie, it was pretty freaky at first, but in a good kind of way. Jared took a few pictures of us under the lights as well as the general ambiance before we headed to the dark mass of shops in front of us. The automatic doors at the entrance were blocked off by security bars, so we found a fire exit. Ever the brave one of the group, Tim swiftly opened the door. No alarm sounded or lights flashed either. It was just a pitch black opening. The air was foul-smelling and stagnant, as if it had been festering in there like a smoke cloud. Spoiler alert, it probably was, and we were going to make it even worse with our own smoking. "Fuck, man," Jared said, fiddling with his camera. "I guess I better turn on the flash." The camera clicked and the white light flashed through the opening for a minute. There was a normal-looking stairwell and interior door off to the side, so we pressed onward. After we passed through the fire exit door, the space opened up to a large cavernous area, devoid of any movement. The linoleum floor was covered in a layer of dust, and whatever fluorescent light that still worked in there somehow produced a sickly pale sheen that made everything look almost slimy. There were two non-functional escalators leading to a top balcony, with even more shops inside smothered in darkness. The only word that came to mind for all three of us was, "Whoa." Jared, as always, snapped a few pictures as we walked around the main lobby. Tim immediately got each of us a blunt. Let me tell ya, the smell of pot mixing with that stale air was not a pleasant one to say the least. Still though, we soldiered on, laughing and egging each other on as the night went forward. Eventually, Jared decided he wanted to get pictures from the top balcony, so up the escalator he went. I remember hearing the click of his camera in the dark and seeing him run from one side to the other, smiling from ear to ear. Tim encouraged him as well. "Dude, check the movie theater out. There's gotta be one up there." Jared beamed at the idea and disappeared into the dark space at the back of the balcony. We waited for the excited reply or disappointed echo, but no sounds came. There was just stillness, aside from that growing weed cloud. Silence as well. Then a loud, earth-shattering crash erupted from somewhere deep in the mall. "Jared!" Tim called out. No response. "Hey man, that's not funny!" I tried. "What was that?" There was no response. Tim and I looked at each other, and I swear I became sober in about 2 seconds when Jared's sudden blood-curdling scream burst out of the empty back rooms. We raced up the escalator, nearly tripping on the way, and found there was indeed a small movie theater right at the back of the balcony. Old movie posters littered the walls, and what separated the ticket booth from the theater door was a thick red curtain. We burst through. The theater was dark, with thick layers of dust floating and swirling in the air. I swung my flashlight down the middle row of seats, and there was Jared. He was pinned by a slab of fallen debris on his left leg. He was trying to talk, but all that would come out were garbled words and quiet wheezing. He looked terrified. We all were. Long story short, we immediately called 911. An ambulance arrived along with fire rescue and police. They took Jared away before turning to me and Tim for our statements. Since our friend was badly injured and we clearly looked shocked and shaken up, they let us off the hook with a harsh warning and a big fine each. I don't think that was what they were supposed to do in cases of trespassing like this, but Tim and I were very grateful. We promised we would never come back here again. Jared's foot was badly injured, almost completely crushed from the force, but thankfully doctors were able to get it working and rehabilitate him eventually. He still has to walk with assistance sometimes, but for the most part he's doing okay. Be careful out there. Accidents could be waiting around any corner. When I was younger, I used to think I was having dreams of an old woman in a blue dress with cat-eyed glasses sitting at the end of my bed and singing a song to me. She would always sing the same song and then leave soon after. One night, I followed her into my brother's room. He's younger than me and was around 5. Instead of singing to him, though, he woke up and they began talking. After 20 minutes, my mother came in and asked what we were doing. My brother told her, "I'm just talking to the lady in the blue dress." She made us go back to bed. I woke up later still thinking that it'd all been a dream. My mom told me the next morning, though, that she didn't want us sneaking out of bed anymore in the middle of the night to go play around in random places. I asked her what she was talking about, and she gave me her version of what she saw the night before. To this day, I believe that was real, though. Every night that old woman would sing to me. I get goosebumps just thinking about it. She stopped doing that to me soon after, though people in my family would still catch my brother going out and speaking to nothing in the night on numerous occasions. A while later, an aunt came to visit from down south and refused to come into our house after seeing an old woman in cat glasses standing in the upstairs window. She came in asking who that was upstairs and freaked out when my mother told her no one was supposed to be there. She even let her search the house, but we never found any trace of the old woman. When I was around 8 or 9, my family and my parents' friends, along with their kids, had a picnic at a park. My friend John and I were running around as kids do, playing tag together. He was older, around 11 at the time. At one point, somehow we got separated. I was clearly lost in this park and I couldn't even find my friend, much less my own parents. That's when a random woman approached me. She was rather tall, had long black curly hair, was fair-skinned and wore thick-rimmed glasses. She must have been in her mid-30s or so. She looked very much like any number of my parents' friends. Initially, the woman simply asked me if I was lost. I nodded sheepishly. She then held out her hand and said she could take me back to my mom. I told her, "It's okay, my friend John will find me." She then asked me this, "Don't you remember me? I'm a friend of your mother's. Come on, I'll take you back to her." Again, I repeated what I'd said before, and that's when she said the creepiest words a stranger had ever told me. "Did you know you have the most beautiful eyes?" Even to an 8 or 9-year-old, I knew this woman was not behaving normally. Sure, I was a really cute kid with big brown eyes and jet black hair, but that's simply not something a stranger who literally just approached me right now should be saying out of nowhere. Just as she reached out her hand and told me we were going to find my mom together, my friend John spontaneously appeared out of nowhere. He looked quite winded. "Where did you go?" he asked. The woman looked a little bit flustered. "Who's this?" "I'm a friend of his mother's," she replied, smiling. "Come on, let's go find her." "Sorry, we're playing a game. Gotta go." John grabbed me by the wrist and yanked me away, and we ran off together. Flash forward to a month or so later. I'm going to the mall with my mom one afternoon. As we're walking around, I suddenly noticed the same woman from the park walking towards us. The same long, curly black hair, fair skin, and thick-rimmed glasses. My mother would always stop and talk if she noticed a friend passing by, and yet this same woman who was clearly walking towards us, who was obviously within my mom's eyesight, this same woman who kept insisting she was a friend of my mother's and that we should go find her together, seemed to be a complete stranger in my mother's eyes. As this woman kept approaching and walking towards us, I remember everything as if in slow motion. She noticed me noticing her. She recognized the fact that I recognized her, and in that very precise moment as we walked right past each other, I looked up, and she smiled down at me with the most devilish smile on her face. Back in the spring of 1999, I was living in a loft apartment in Boulder, Colorado. The ceiling above my kitchen table leaked whenever it rained, and the window air conditioning unit was a lot louder than even a freight train. Otherwise, it was pretty acceptable though. It was cozy with a great view of the Rocky Mountains. At the time, I was writing articles for a paper. After I had finished working my shift at the hardware store, I would spend about 3 hours writing and editing my column before bed. Because of this, I normally wouldn't get to sleep until 1 or 2 in the morning. Directly across the hall from me was a second loft apartment, which had been empty for a few years before a middle-aged woman and her cats eventually moved in. They were the only 2 apartments on the second floor of the building. Our doors didn't have numbers or indicators such as apartment A or B to distinguish the 2 separate residences though. I had a P.O. box, and I'd never received any mail at home anyway, so that didn't bother me too much. It did cause some confusion though, that I believe nearly resulted in my death. One evening, I was typing away on my computer while listening to soft classical music on the radio. When I got up to refill my glass of wine as I walked past my front door, I don't know why, but I got a completely random impulse that I needed to look out the peephole right now. I don't know exactly what I expected to see. It was just after 1 in the morning after all, but sometimes you just need that peace of mind, which is exactly what I didn't get. Standing outside my neighbor's door, directly across from me, was a short, heavy-set bald man with gloves on his hands and no shoes. I remember spotting his gray socks against the dark wooden color of the floorboards. He He wore a dark green windbreaker and jeans and appeared to be testing the knob of my neighbor's door. I remember the sensation of my heart skipping a beat. I had no idea who this man was. I'd never seen him before in the building, but it was his actions more than his appearance that made me uneasy. It was clear he was trying to be very stealthy. He had no keys, but was turning the knob back and forth to see if it was unlocked. I stared at him suspiciously for perhaps 30 to 40 seconds. I was concentrating very hard on keeping quiet, aware that if he got the door open, I may have to run and find my phone to call 911. After another few moments, he released her knob and bent down to open a gym bag by his feet that I hadn't noticed before. I caught a side view of his face. He looked older than I'd initially expected. Suddenly, noticing his face made me nervous for some reason. I began to feel my palms starting to sweat, realizing I still had my glass in one hand. I took a careful step away from the door and set it down on the table. I returned with both hands carefully pressed against the wood, as if making to reinforce it or something. I peered out through the peephole again. My blood froze. The man was looking directly at my door now, standing completely still. There was a look of suspicion in his dark eyes, and a crowbar clutched in his left hand. My heart began pounding loud in my ears. I was convinced that somehow this stranger could hear it. The kind of peephole the door had didn't really work only one way like most of them do. Nowadays, there's a kind of frosted glass on the outside to blur the view of whoever is looking in. Inside, all the lights in my apartment were out, except for my desk lamp. When I had stepped away from the door, he had seen the lamp shining through the peephole. When I'd stepped back, he'd noticed the small pinprick of light vanishing. I felt sweat begin to form on the back of my neck as the man took 2 steps forward and jiggled my own doorknob. Thankfully, it was securely locked. I forced myself to stay put, worried that if he made to break in, even with my full weight on the door, I would not be able to prevent him from doing so. The man jiggled the knob twice more. I was terrified by the fact that we were so close together. Had the door not been there, he would have been able to feel my breath on his skin. I watched as the man again looked up at the peephole. I remember his blue eyes feeling cold, savage, and malicious. I knew he intended to cause me or my neighbor hard, and that's when the unthinkable happened. He knocked softly 3 times on my door. I heard him whisper through it, "Open up." There was no way he could have known for sure I was there. I imagined he was trying to get a reaction in case someone was standing there, but I was legitimately too terrified to move or speak. In fact, I was barely even breathing. It was clear to me that's what he was doing, because if I had been across the room at my computer, there was no way I would have heard that knock. It was a direct threat to whoever was close enough to hear it. The man stood there for another 10 seconds, then grabbed his bag and headed back down the stairs, barely making any noise on the wood thanks to him not wearing shoes. I remember being too afraid to turn my back on the door. I was terrified he was bluffing and he would come back upstairs at any moment. I made myself count to 20. Then I took a deep breath and walked across the room to my desk. I picked up my Nokia cell phone and called the police, whispering the entire time. I informed the operator that there was a suspicious man right outside my apartment door, but I had barely spoken for a full minute when she informed me that a squad car was already en route to that address. I happened to glance out the window and noticed the bald man was standing on the sidewalk beneath me. When he saw me peeking, he waved a hand up at me, then disappeared across the street into an alleyway. I nearly choked on my breath and told the operator exactly where the man had gone. When the police arrived an agonizingly slow few minutes later, they searched the alleyway before coming up to interview me and my neighbor. She had called the police a few minutes before I had because she had seen the shadows of feet coming from under her door in her dark apartment. It was revealed that she was in the witness protection program, and before the morning came, she and her cats were taken away by 2 men. I never saw her again. I went to the station the following day and provided a description of the man to a sketch artist. To this day, I'm not positive if this stranger was specifically looking for my neighbor, but if I had to guess, I would say it wasn't just a burglar looking to rob one of us. My theory is that because there were no numbers on the doors, he wasn't sure which apartment was hers, and therefore had to test both of them when he wasn't sure which apartment to break into. He decided to play it safe and leave once he knew I was there. To the best of my knowledge, they never caught him. I have nothing but my own personal suspicions to go off of, but I suspect my neighbor may have had something to do with the ongoing trial of Whitey Bulger and the Winter Hill Gang. When she had spoken to the police, I noticed her distinct Boston accent, and a year later it was all over the papers how he and his gang member associates were being charged with multiple murders and colluding with a crooked FBI agent. The following day, I added 3 more locks to my door. I never saw that man again or anyone else suspicious outside my door. I lived there for another 4 years, and that second apartment was never rented out again. This past August, I picked up a lot of side jobs house-sitting while working at a ranch that gave horseback riding lessons. The families were all very nice, and it paid well, too. This past November, I was house-sitting for a family and watching their golden retriever named Maggie while they were on vacation. They lived in a very nice neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town. The house was at the far end, and thick trees flanked the backyard. A dirt road ran behind the trees. I accidentally went down that road the first time I tried to find the house, but there wasn't much back there, just an abandoned home with lots of deer in the front yard and a small run-down ranch house. The first night everything was great, but the second night not so much. I had this weird feeling a few hours before I went to bed, but I initially wrote it off as spending too much time reading creepy stories online. I simply made sure all the doors were locked and the blinds were closed. Then I went to bed just after midnight. As I fell asleep, though, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. Maggie would usually sleep with me, but that night she just followed me up the stairs into the bedroom, then sulked back downstairs. At 2:26 a.m., Maggie woke me up by standing next to the bed and whining. I'd just let her out before I went to bed, and I was pretty sure she didn't have to go to the bathroom. I rolled over and hoped she would stop, but she didn't. I gave in soon enough, and as I climbed out of bed, I realized the house was freezing cold for some reason. I followed Maggie downstairs to the kitchen. All the doors to this house were kind of weird. You couldn't open any of them from the inside or outside without a key. Not to mention, these were very heavy doors, not the kind that just get blown open by the wind. The only thing that eased my mind was that Maggie didn't seem ready to kill an intruder. She'd usually bark at any strangers. I did a quick look around, but I was too scared to do anything more. Nothing seemed to be out of place. The owners often left credit and debit cards as well as wads of cash lying on the counters, and it was all there if anyone was going to steal something. It was right next to the door too, so it was easy pickings, but nothing was missing. I tried to brush this all off. I went back to bed. Maggie still didn't want to sleep with me though, and went back downstairs. Less than an hour later, she woke me up again. This time, I didn't question her. I crept back down the stairs more cautiously than I had before. The back door was wide open. This time, the key that had been sitting on the kitchen counter was in the lock. Someone had been in the house with me. The police were called. They looked all around the house but found nothing of value lost. Everything was still in place. I was worried about the intentions of whoever broke in. The family was shocked that something like that had happened and have since moved away to a large farm about 30 minutes away. They now have video surveillance as well. I didn't have the best home life growing up. I lived alone in suburbia, with a father who was passed out drunk half the time and emotionally absent, or at work the other half. I'd have to find ways to entertain myself. Don't get me wrong, I had a couple good buddies that I did stuff after school with, but I never really felt comfortable inviting them over to my house to hang out. We always resorted to going over to one of theirs or hanging out at McDonald's or some other place downtown. On days where they were all busy or once it got late though, I'd have to pick up the slack so I wouldn't get bored and go insane. That resulted in a brief hobby of urban exploration. My dad never really set rules or times I had to be home, so I would just go about my business as I pleased, trying to find really cool spots and just seeing what I could find. I could eat up hours away from my depressing home and come away with a really good story, so what was there not to like? My house was also in a prime spot for this sort of thing, sitting at the very edge of a strip of woods. It was what was on the other side of the trees that made my expeditions worthwhile, a strip of unfinished development housing that had been abandoned a decade prior. It was an entire street of unclaimed territory, each one finished to different degrees. Some were nearly done, just needing a coat of paint, while others only had their frames and some drywall. I liked the finished houses the best though. They were so cool to navigate. I would pretend that I had my own place that had more structure to it, no pun intended, picturing how I would decorate and paint everything. No one knows exactly why the project was abandoned. Maybe the area became unfit or the workers weren't paid fairly. I don't know, and I can't really explain it myself. What I can explain, however, is what I found in the houses sometimes. There were all these little trinkets that I assumed were either left by people looking into the homes or squatters that were long gone. Stuff like old newspapers, empty wallets, even a rare piece of jewelry from time to time. I never found their owners, not that I tried really, so I kept anything I could find hidden in my dresser at home. My dad wasn't the type to look into my personal business or anything, so I knew they'd be safe there. I'd say I'd explored roughly 70% of this housing development by 9th grade, so before 10th grade ended, I was determined to map out the rest of it. I decided to start from the part I had never seen before on the east side. When things started to look familiar, I would know I'd succeeded without getting too lost. After making sure my dad was safe on the couch in front of the TV playing football on a loop one night, I headed out. I packed a flashlight and some snacks and texted my buddies so at least someone would know where I was if my dad was too drunk to notice. I wasn't really worried about anything going wrong though. The first couple houses in this area were just their frames. Faded blue tarp crinkled under my shoes as I moved around. The one notable thing I should mention was when I shined my flashlight up at the rafters, an owl blinked back at me. Probably had a nest up there too. I thought about going up there to check what was up there, but A, the beams didn't look too stable, and B, I didn't want to mess it up or get angry owl mom claws to the face. I decided to continue on. After updating my buddies about the owl friend, I went out to the street and saw a little path I had never seen before. It was made of padded down dirt and led through a few hedges and down a slope. Intrigued, I didn't hesitate to follow this new path. Maybe this was a new section I just hadn't seen, or an extension of someone's would-be backyard. Either way, I was excited to find out. The path wound up going further down than I expected, and if it weren't for the moon and my flashlight, I would be wandering around a dark expanse without any identifying landmarks. That's when I laid my eyes upon a park. It looked like someone was an aspiring construction worker in their off time. Rusted metal, a broken swing set, a sagging jungle gym. It definitely looked like it got a lot of love in its working days though, so I can't fault the builder for that. All the faded graffiti scribbled onto the set was pretty awesome too. I spent a good few minutes going over all the art on the jungle gym, snapping pictures for good measure, before I decided to try the swing set. One swing had broken free from its chain on one side, but the other still looked fine. I took a seat and started swinging. It almost made me feel like a little kid again, back when my dad was far more stable, and we tried to go to parks like this often together. "Hello!" A voice called out from somewhere behind me. My feet skidded to a stop and I almost stumbled off the swing. The air suddenly felt cold, and I could feel goosebumps working their way along my arms. In all my time exploring out here, I'd never encountered another person, only the things they'd left behind. I whirled around, pointing my flashlight in the direction the voice had come from, but nothing was there. I could only hear the rustling of the wind through the trees and grass. That is, until the voice called again, this time from the opposite direction. To my horror, it sounded much, much closer. "Hello? Are you there?" I knew it wouldn't be a good idea to reply, so I kept my mouth shut. I didn't know who this was that was calling me, or what they wanted, but whatever reason they had, it certainly would not be good. I decided now might be best for me to leave, so I booked it. The swing made a ton of noise as I rocketed out. It banged against the metal pole so hard, it sounded like a gunshot. It made my heart jump. I don't know if the person was following me, but I didn't want to stop to find out. Through the pounding in my ears, I heard a distinct and angry yell though. "Come back! Play with me!" That sent me into even more panic. I tore through the trees separating the lot from my house, not caring how the branches scratched up my face. My phone buzzed constantly in my pocket, my buddies calling to make sure I was okay. I reached my house, and I'd never felt so grateful to see my dad was home, or hearing those stupid football games on repeat blaring from the TV. I raced inside, slammed the kitchen door, and locked it. My dad was startled awake and only looked at me dazed and confused before going right back to sleep. Long story short, I didn't go back to that unfinished housing development for quite a while after. When I was about 7 years old, I was at a friend's birthday party. We'd gone to the local cinema with a group of 6 kids, my friend, and her mother. I had to use the bathroom during the movie, and I told her mom, assuming she would come with me. Even back then, I knew going to places alone as a kid could be dangerous, but she didn't go with me. I went out to the bathroom alone. I must mention it was a small local cinema which was really old, and most of the time it was completely empty. It wasn't like regular theaters nowadays that always have people bustling about. Anyway, on my way to the bathroom, I saw some guy leaning against the concession counter, seemingly with nothing to do. I thought maybe he was waiting for his kids to come out of the restroom or something. At this place, the bathroom was one small room that was divided into 2 halves. On one side was 2 stalls for men, on the other was 2 stalls for women. I entered the bathroom and sat down to do my business. The guy came in as well about a minute after me. I could see his shadow under the door of the stall I was sitting in. He was walking back and forth outside of it. He shouldn't have been over on the woman's side at all, and no one else was in the restroom with us. I began to panic. I stayed there for a couple of minutes, too scared to leave the stall. Eventually, he did leave, and I decided to go back. When I walked out of the restroom, he was standing there blocking the doorway. He was standing with his arms and legs spread out like he was about to grab me and scoop me up. My heart started racing. He was more than twice my size. I was terrified. Luckily, I thought fast enough to jump through the gap between his legs. I skidded on the carpet and burned my knees. I got up as fast as I could and ran back to the theater my party was in. I wish it had ended there. That night at home, I remember hiding this doll I had. For some reason, I thought the man was still going to come for me, and I wanted to make sure all my stuff was safe. My mom noticed me acting weird and asked me what was wrong. I blurted out that a man had tried to grab me when I was at the cinema. She kind of brushed it off, but I think she was trying to act like nothing was wrong for my sake. I could see in her eyes that she was quite worried. Later, I heard her and my dad talking, and she asked me what the guy looked like. Did he have a black mustache? Did he have messy hair? He did, but I didn't know how she knew those things. It turned out he was at the house earlier that day, replacing the window. He must have overheard me and my mom talking about the party later. I don't know what he was planning on doing if he did manage to grab me. Was he going to kidnap me or do something else? I'm just glad he didn't succeed. I brought it all up with my mom last night, and she looked very surprised for a moment. I guess she didn't think I would even remember the incident after all this time. But how could I ever forget? She seemed very uneasy talking about it, but I eventually got it out of her that the guy was never caught. I'll admit that when she said this, I had a moment of sinking feeling in my chest. They never saw or heard from the guy again. She told me they did inform the police, but they assumed he had skipped town after failing to kidnap me out of fear of being identified. I can't help but feel worried though. Worried he may have caught another kid, that they may not have been as lucky as I was. All I can really hope is that this piece of shit was scared out of attempting this again, and no kids were harmed. I once asked my great-uncle what his absolute worst memory was from his youth. He didn't hesitate at all when he told me it was the night he went to see the movie Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood. It was 1971 in a small theater in Wyoming. My great-uncle and his best friend had bought tickets for $1.50 each to get in and see the movie. The cinema had a single screen, and they were sitting in the very back row. They intended to smoke cigarettes and didn't want to be caught and thrown out. He recalled there being only about 4 or 5 other people in the theater. For those of you who are unaware with the flick, Clint Eastwood played a loose cannon cop who was borderline insane and on the hunt for a serial killer who called himself Scorpio. The plot was heavily inspired by the real-life Zodiac killer. It was mainly that reason the two of them had skipped school to check the movie out. My uncle was big into true crime and unsolved mysteries. He told me that as he was watching the movie, he was being distracted by what smelled like spoiled meat. Even the cigarettes didn't help to hide the scent. Once the movie was over, his friend immediately wanted to leave and escape that putrid smell, but instead my uncle bent down and started looking underneath the seats out of curiosity. 2 rows ahead of him, he noticed what appeared to be some sort of meat patty lying forgotten on the ground. He made his way over to it, confused about how it had been overlooked by the staff. When he reached the correct aisle and bent down, he then shot up again just as quickly and started freaking out and cursing in shock. What he'd originally believed to be just a harmless piece of hamburger meat or something was in fact somebody's severed hand. It was a left hand. The flesh was soggy and gray, sitting in a thick stain of blood. A handful of flies were buzzing around it. What was even worse is that 3 of the fingers were detached and scattered around the floor, not far away. My uncle told me there was only 1 employee there at the time. He was a very overweight attendant who was sitting up front smoking a cigar. The man didn't even believe him at all until he actually grabbed one of the fingers and wrapped it up in his handkerchief. When the attendant saw it, he grabbed it and headed over to the theater with a dustpan and broom, looking more annoyed than alarmed. Another one of the theater patrons noticed what was going on and went across the street to call the police. My uncle's friend didn't wait for the police to arrive. Instead, he ditched on his bike and rode home. My uncle stayed and watched as the police questioned the attendant and the man who had made the call. The attendant denied everything, even after my uncle spoke up and told them where he had found the hand. The police went inside the theater and apparently saw enough blood on the floor that they took the attendant in for questioning. They never actually interviewed my uncle properly though. He ended up just riding on his bike home, practically being ignored and forgotten by all the adults in the room. He never found out the exact story behind the severed hand. He suspected the attendant and other members of the staff may have tortured someone in there after hours, cutting off their fingers first before removing their entire hand. The theater was shut down several months later and eventually condemned. I asked my uncle why this was his worst memory and not his most exciting. He simply replied because whoever owned that hand was very likely killed, and the killers would never be caught or brought to justice. He says he can still remember the smell of the rotting flesh and the sound of the buzzing flies circling around it. I remember seeing this house for the first time. I was 7 years old and my parents had just bought their first home. I remember I used to hate living in the cramped, dingy apartment we previously inhabited and opened the door to our new home with wide-eyed wonder. It blew my mind how spacious this house was. I went upstairs to scope out my bedroom. I was so excited I was getting my own room and I wouldn't have to share one with my little brother anymore. On my grand tour of my new house, I finally made it down to our basement. The basement was nothing like the rest of the house though. The upstairs was elegant and classy. The basement was cold, metallic, and sterile. The ceiling was covered in ancient-looking pipes, winding at grotesque angles. The floor was covered in rough cement. I recall taking a look at the stairs for the first time and being immediately struck with how odd they were. The stairs were surrounded in drywall, which clashed with the rest of the basement. One particular section of the wall was colored differently than the rest as well. It stood out like a sore thumb. I inched closer and felt the texture. It felt very strange. I knocked on it, and a hollow sound echoed in the empty air of the basement. Something about that sound immediately bothered me. As I walked up the stairs, I could hear the same hollowing sound echoing in the emptiness of that basement. As we settled into our new home, I began to get comfortable with my surroundings. The house began to feel more familiar, everywhere that is, except for the basement. It just always put me off, and I avoided going down there as best I could. Our family couldn't be any happier though. My loving father and mother doted over me and my little brother. My life was perfect. Then it began, though. I would hear these strange noises. When I pointed it out to my parents, they told me it was just the house settling in. One night in particular, though, indicated that something was not right. I snuck downstairs to the kitchen for a late-night snack. As I closed the refrigerator, I thought I could hear a tapping sound cutting through the silence in the night. I craned my head to see if I could pinpoint where the sound was coming from. Dread began to wash over me as I realized this tapping was coming from the basement. I inched my way over to the basement door. I opened it to see the blackness below. My ears perked up. There it was again, that hollow tapping sound. It was the same kind of sound I'd heard on my initial visit to the basement from hitting that drywall. I turned the lights on so I could go downstairs and investigate the tapping. It continued as I took the first step. Fear overtook me, and I ran back to my room. I hid under my covers until the morning light gave way to a new day. I remember walking down the stairs, being the first one who woke up. I ran to the living room to play some Nintendo. On my way, I passed the door to the basement. I was in a state of near panic when I ran from it the previous night, and I distinctly remembered leaving the door open and not turning off the lights either. I rationalized that maybe my mother or father had gone down there for some reason later. I mentioned this incident to my parents, and they assured me that what I'd heard was the sound of the hot water heater clicking in the night. I knew better, but I welcomed a logical explanation. About a month after the move, my mother asked me to run downstairs and grab a load of socks, as our washer and dryer were in the basement. I reluctantly told her I would do it. It was in the middle of the day, and enough time had passed to dull the fear I had felt a week prior. I turned on the lights and ran downstairs, hearing the hollow echo sound with my footsteps. A cold sweat started to form on me. I made my way to the dryer and grabbed a basket. I pulled the socks out hastily and shoved them in. After I shut the door to the dryer, I surveyed my surroundings. The stillness of the basement was so eerie. Then I heard it. A faint, barely audible whisper. At first, I thought it was somebody calling from upstairs, their voice scarcely making it down to the basement. However, this was not the case. I could hear the sound was coming from the basement itself, specifically from underneath the stairs. I stood frozen with fear. It began to increase in volume, but still remained barely above the threshold of me being able to hear what was being said. It was incomprehensible to my young ears. It stopped just as quickly as it began. I moved towards the stairs, keeping my eyes on the oddly colored portion of the drywall. As I took my first step to escape this ever-growing nightmare, the most profoundly terrifying moment of my life occurred. A loud, hollow bang shook the stairs, almost knocking me to the ground in surprise. I ran up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, through tears. I was shaking uncontrollably. I told my parents what happened, and they tried their best to calm me down, but nothing they said could ease my mind. I told them in no uncertain terms that I would never go down to the basement again. They must have been convinced by how terrified I was, because they honored my request and never sent me down there again. After another 3 months in the house, things returned to normalcy for me. Honestly, there was about a 2-week period where I was happy again. The last time happiness would exist in my life or my family's for that matter. One moment in particular comes to mind. I remember lifting my little brother above my head lovingly as his pacifier fell out of his mouth and brushed against my nose. I pulled him in for a big hug. I remember how he smelled, that wonderful smell that babies emit, for the last time feeling content. Any semblance of contentment came crashing down from me and my parents the night of July 2nd, 1991. That's the day Jonathan went missing. A ransom note was scrawled in barely legible English and left in his bed, demanding $20,000 in cash. It informed my parents that if they contacted the police, they would kill Jonathan. My mother and father took to their room and argued loudly and emotionally over whether or not to call. I listened with tears streaming down my eyes. My mother eventually wore down my father, and the police were called. Seeing as the location of the drop and time were indicated on the note, the police set up a wiretap just in case the kidnapper decided to call. I asked my parents and the police if they had thoroughly searched the house, just in case he was still there. They assured me they had, and Jonathan would be fine after the drop. The seed of an idea was already growing in my mind, though. It would blossom throughout the rest of my life. My parents followed the instructions to a T. They dropped off the money, then waited in the location they were supposed to pick Jonathan up at. He never came. Needless to say, this tore my family apart. As the weeks passed, there was no news about Jonathan. My young, vibrant parents became husks of their former selves. My mother especially blamed herself for getting the police involved and believed that to be the reason Jonathan was not returned. One night, as she was sobbing alone in shambles, clutching a bottle of wine, I finally decided to divulge to her my theory. I told her I thought it was whoever or whatever was under the stairs that had gotten Jonathan. Maybe he was still alive. She slapped me across the face so hard I saw stars. She screamed at me as she told me to stop the childish shit and accept Jonathan was taken out of the house by a demented person and was dead. My childhood died that day. I remember contemplating taking a hammer myself and exposing whatever was under the stairs, but the fear was too overwhelming for me to actually do it. My family moved shortly after the incident. I remember looking to the future with what might resemble optimism, only to have it come crashing down. My parents divorced. The grief was too much to share. Not a year later after that, my mother blew herself. The guilt must have overwhelmed her. My father did his best to raise me, but Jonathan's shadow always hung over our lives. 20 years later, I began to think long and hard about my brother's disappearance, how angry it made me. My family had a chance at a normal and fulfilling life, but it was snuffed out in an instant by whoever took him. I wasn't just robbed of a little brother, I was robbed of any chance of happiness as I grew up. I accepted the official story of what happened, but lately curiosity began to get the better of me. I began driving past our old house, seeing that it was currently vacant. An idea began to swirl in my head. I broke into the house bolstered by alcohol. I decided to do it knowing I would likely find nothing under the basement stairs, but hoping this would close a too long chapter in my life and allow me to finally move on. The stairs sounded exactly the same as I remembered they did, a hollow sound pervading the basement. I stared at the spot in the drywall which was still discolored, ominous as ever. I was feeling a courage I hadn't felt in a long time. The moment of truth was upon me. With all the force within me, emboldened by years of pent-up rage, I ran towards the wall shoulder first. The drywall came crashing down immediately. I opened my eyes and the bravery immediately turned into horror. I saw bones on the ground. There I discovered Jonathan's skeleton. I informed the police, but it had been so long they were not able to find any further clues as to what happened, and the case went cold again.